Imagine standing at the edge of a city that appears to rise endlessly into the sky, a place where towers of steel and glass catch the light of the sun during the day and transform into a glowing constellation of windows when night slowly settles over the island of Manhattan. Millions of people walk through these streets every day believing they understand the story of this city, repeating a familiar narrative about settlers, immigration, industrial growth, and the unstoppable ambition that turned a small colonial settlement into one of the most powerful urban centers in the world. According to that story, everything happened step by step, generation after generation, as people arrived with tools, knowledge, and determination to build something greater than what existed before. Yet architecture has a strange quality that historians quietly rely on when they attempt to understand the past, because buildings preserve the memory of their creation in ways that written records often fail to capture. Every carved stone carries subtle traces of the tools that shaped it. Every column reflects the mathematical understanding of the engineers who designed it, and every street grid reveals the intentions of the planners who imagined how a city should function centuries into the future. When archaeologists study ancient civilizations, they rarely begin with stories or legends, because they begin with the physical evidence left behind in stone, brick, and geometry. When the architecture of New York is examined with the same careful attention that scholars apply to forgotten empires, a quiet but unsettling question begins to emerge, because some of the structures scattered throughout Manhattan appear strangely disproportionate to the historical narrative that supposedly explains their origin. Certain buildings possess monumental entrances and staircases so vast that a single person walking through them appears almost insignificant, while decorative stonework displays a level of symmetry and precision that seems unusually sophisticated for the tools that were supposedly available during the earliest phases of the city's construction. At first, these details may seem insignificant, the kind of observations that curious researchers occasionally mention, but that most people quickly dismiss as coincidence or stylistic preference. However, once the eye begins to notice them, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore because the scale of the architecture, the density of early construction, and the sudden appearance of massive stone structures in historical records begin to form a picture that does not entirely align with the simple explanation that humans gradually built everything from the ground up. Old photographs from the 19th century reveal entire blocks of elaborate buildings already standing with enormous facades, intricate carvings, and towering windows that stretch far higher than what would normally be required for practical living spaces. These structures appear not as primitive early attempts at urban construction, but as confident and mature examples of architectural mastery, as if the builders already possessed a deep understanding of geometry, engineering, and large-scale stonework that had been perfected long before those photographs were ever taken. The more one studies the skyline of New York, the more it begins to resemble something other than a purely modern invention, because beneath the glass surfaces and renovated interiors, there remain older layers of design that feel strangely ancient in their proportions and logic. Some entrances appear unnecessarily large, some halls stretch upward with cathedral-like ceilings, and some foundations extend far deeper into the earth than would normally be required for buildings constructed during the early years of the city's recorded history. At this point, a strange possibility begins to take shape, a thought that sounds almost impossible at first, but refuses to disappear once it enters the mind. What if the city that millions of people proudly call a triumph of human engineering is not entirely the product of human creation? And what if the earliest settlers who arrived on this island did not build the first version of the city at all, but instead discovered fragments of something that had already existed long before their ships appeared on the horizon? If that idea were true, even partially, It would mean that the towering landscape of New York might not represent the beginning of a civilization, but rather the continuation of one whose origins have been quietly forgotten, leaving behind a city whose true story may still be hidden in the silent language of its
Hello,
architecture.
friends. My name is Laurel, and I'm happy to see you on my channel, Unsolved Shadows.
If you begin exploring the historical records of New York with patience and careful attention, an unusual pattern slowly starts to reveal itself through old photographs, early maps, and the written descriptions left behind by travelers who visited the city during the 19th century. These documents often show a place that seems to transform at a pace that feels strangely accelerated, as if entire sections of the city appeared within a surprisingly short period of time, already filled with massive buildings whose architectural complexity suggests a long tradition of craftsmanship that should have taken generations to develop. When historians attempt to reconstruct the timeline of construction, they frequently describe an explosive period of urban expansion in which stone buildings, elaborate facades, and monumental civic structures began to dominate the landscape of Manhattan. At first glance, such rapid growth may appear to be nothing more than the natural result of industrial progress combined with the economic energy of a rapidly growing nation, because the 19th century was indeed a time of intense transformation throughout the United States. Railroads expanded across the continent, factories multiplied in major cities, and millions of immigrants arrived bringing labor, knowledge, and ambition. However, when one looks more closely at the architectural details present in many early photographs of New York, the scale and refinement of some buildings begins to feel oddly mature, as if the city skipped several stages of architectural development that most civilizations experience gradually over long stretches of time. Entire blocks of stone buildings appear in historical images with intricate carvings already completed, with decorative cornices stretching across the roofs and enormous windows framed by symmetrical stonework that reflects a deep understanding of geometry and structural balance. These are not simple frontier constructions made quickly from basic materials by settlers struggling to establish a foothold in a new land, but rather confident expressions of architectural mastery that resemble the work of a society already deeply familiar with large-scale urban design. The level of detail present in these structures suggests workshops full of highly specialized artisans, sophisticated tools capable of shaping stone with remarkable precision, and a stable architectural tradition that had been refined over many decades before these buildings ever appeared in photographs. Another detail that continues to puzzle observers is the apparent uniformity of many early districts, where rows of buildings share proportions and decorative styles that appear remarkably consistent with one another. Such harmony normally emerges only after long periods of urban planning and cultural continuity. Yet historical narratives describe Manhattan during this era as a chaotic and rapidly evolving settlement where construction occurred wherever opportunity allowed. The contradiction between the expected disorder of a young frontier city and the disciplined symmetry visible in the architecture creates a subtle tension that historians rarely address directly. Even more intriguing is the way some buildings appear fully mature in the earliest images that survive, without any visible stages of earlier construction or transitional forms that would normally reveal how architectural styles evolve. It is almost as if the city emerged with a fully developed architectural language already in place, complete with monumental facades, enormous public halls, and structural solutions that seem surprisingly advanced for the tools and resources that were supposedly available at the time. When these observations are placed side by side, a quiet question begins to take shape in the mind of anyone willing to examine the evidence without immediately dismissing the possibility that the accepted narrative might be incomplete. If the early settlers of New York truly built every stone building that appeared during this explosive period of expansion, then they must have possessed an extraordinary level of organization, technological capability, and architectural knowledge that somehow left very little trace in the historical record describing their methods. Yet if that knowledge did not suddenly appear out of nowhere, then another possibility begins to emerge, one that feels both unsettling and strangely logical at the same time. Perhaps the rapid emergence of monumental architecture in early New York was not the result of settlers building everything from the ground up, but rather the process of rediscovering and adapting structures that had already existed in some form long before the official story of the city began. When observers begin to pay closer attention to the physical scale of many older structures scattered across Manhattan, another peculiar detail gradually becomes impossible to ignore because numerous buildings seem to have been designed according to proportions that feel strangely excessive for ordinary human use. Architectural historians usually explain large interiors and tall facades as stylistic preferences that symbolized wealth, ambition, and civic pride during the period of rapid urban expansion. Yet this explanation does not always feel entirely satisfying when one stands directly in front of some of these structures and studies their dimensions with a careful eye. Many entrances appear unusually tall and wide, as if they were meant to welcome something larger than the average person walking through the streets of a 19th century city. Staircases in certain buildings rise in long, sweeping flights, whose steps are slightly taller and deeper than what feels naturally comfortable for the human stride, while ceilings soar upward in enormous chambers where the distance between the floor and the roof creates a space that feels almost cathedral-like rather than practical for everyday activity. In modern architecture, these choices are often intentional aesthetic statements, yet the question becomes more complicated when similar proportions appear repeatedly in structures that were supposedly constructed during a time when efficiency and practicality were essential for a young and rapidly growing settlement. Windows in some of these early buildings stretch vertically across several levels in a way that seems excessive if the only purpose was to provide light for ordinary rooms. Columns stand thicker and taller than necessary for the structural loads they support, and decorative arches appear above doors that already possess more than enough strength to hold the weight of the masonry above them. When these details are viewed individually, they might appear to be simple artistic decisions, but when they repeat across many structures throughout the city, they begin to create the faint impression that the original design logic followed a different set of assumptions than those typically used in human-centered architecture. Another curious observation emerges when examining early interiors that have survived renovation or partial preservation, because some halls appear to possess a monumental scale that feels closer to ceremonial architecture than to the daily living spaces expected in early urban housing. Massive pillars support ceilings that extend upward in long vaulted spans, and corridors stretch across surprisingly large distances before reaching their destinations, giving the sensation that the buildings were originally conceived with movement patterns different from those of a typical household or workplace. If these spaces were truly designed for the settlers who first occupied Manhattan, then the architects behind them must have been remarkably comfortable dedicating enormous amounts of material and labor to create volumes of space far larger than what was strictly necessary. However, if one allows the mind to wander beyond the familiar explanation, another possibility quietly appears on the horizon of speculation, suggesting that these structures might have been conceived with entirely different occupants in mind, inhabitants whose physical scale or social rituals required architecture of greater height, broader passages, and more imposing interiors. Such a thought may sound fantastical when expressed directly, yet architecture often reveals truths that written history forgets, because proportions rarely lie about the intentions of the builders who created them. If the earliest layers of New York contain buildings whose dimensions subtly exceed the needs of the people who later used them, then the city might still be carrying silent evidence that its first designers imagined a world inhabited by figures who moved through space very differently from the humans who eventually claimed these streets as their own. When researchers shift their attention away from the scale of buildings and begin to examine the layout of Manhattan itself, another mystery slowly emerges from the pattern of streets that shape the island. At first glance, the design appears simple and practical, because most people are familiar with the idea that New York follows a grid system in which long avenues run north and south, while numbered streets stretch across the island from east to west. This structure is often explained as a rational planning decision made during the early 19th century, when city officials supposedly decided to impose order on a growing settlement by creating a clear geometric structure that would guide future development. However, the more carefully one studies the precision of this grid, the more remarkable it begins to appear. The lines stretch across the island with extraordinary regularity, maintaining a consistent rhythm that continues for kilometers, with only minor interruptions caused by the natural geography of the land. From a modern perspective, this may not seem particularly impressive, because contemporary engineering allows planners to design entire cities using satellite imagery, advanced surveying equipment, and digital modeling tools capable of calculating distances with extreme accuracy. Yet the grid of Manhattan was conceived at a time when surveyors relied primarily on manual instruments, chains for measuring distance, and visual alignment techniques that required patience and careful observation rather than computerized precision. Creating such a large and consistent layout across uneven terrain would have required enormous coordination, countless measurements, and an almost obsessive commitment to maintaining geometric alignment over long distances. The remarkable consistency visible in the modern map suggests a level of planning discipline that feels unusually ambitious for a settlement that was supposedly still developing its infrastructure and population during the early stages of its growth. Even more intriguing is the way the grid interacts with the island's natural landscape, because the plan does not simply follow the easiest routes across hills and valleys, but instead imposes a rigid structure that cuts through the terrain with quiet determination. In many places, the streets ignore the natural curves of the land entirely, forcing later generations to level hills, reshape the ground, and carve pathways through rock in order to maintain the strict geometry established by the original design. Such dedication to geometric order suggests that the planners believed the layout itself possessed importance beyond simple convenience. When viewed from above, the streets form a vast network of rectangles that extend across the island, like the lines of an enormous mechanical diagram. Some observers have compared the pattern to the structure of a circuit board or a massive framework intended to organize movement, energy, or communication within a complex system. While these comparisons may sound speculative, they reveal an interesting truth about how unusual the scale of the grid truly is when considered within the historical context of early American cities. Most settlements grow organically over time, with streets curving around existing buildings, following rivers, or adapting to the unpredictable patterns of daily life. Manhattan, by contrast, appears almost as if it were designed according to a single conceptual vision that prioritized geometric clarity above all other considerations. This raises an intriguing question about the origins of the plan itself, because such a vast and disciplined layout feels less like the spontaneous development of a young colony and more like the execution of an idea that had already been imagined in remarkable detail. If one allows the imagination to wander slightly beyond conventional explanations, the grid begins to resemble something even more mysterious. Instead of merely serving as a convenient arrangement of roads, the pattern could be interpreted as the skeletal framework of a much larger structure, a design that once organized the movement of people, goods, or perhaps even forms of energy that no longer exist within the modern city. Whether this interpretation reflects reality or simply the human tendency to search for hidden meaning remains uncertain. Yet the precision of Manhattan's geometry continues to whisper that the origins of the city's design may hold secrets that history has not fully explained. When historians and architects begin to examine the decorative stonework present on many of New York's older buildings, another layer of mystery slowly reveals itself through details that are often overlooked by people rushing through the city's streets. At first, these carvings appear to be nothing more than ornamental flourishes placed by ambitious architects who wish to give their buildings a sense of prestige and permanence. Yet the deeper one studies the complexity of these designs, the more difficult it becomes to ignore the extraordinary level of craftsmanship required to produce them, especially when considering the tools that were supposedly available during the 19th century. Many facades throughout Manhattan display intricate patterns of stone carving that repeat with near-perfect symmetry across entire building fronts. Delicate floral patterns intertwine with geometric shapes, sculpted figures appear frozen within arches, and ornamental frames surround windows with a level of precision that suggests an almost mechanical consistency. Such work requires an immense amount of time, skill, and patience, because carving hard stone with manual tools demands careful planning and remarkable control over every strike of the chisel. However, certain architectural historians have quietly pointed out that some of these carvings appear almost too precise for purely manual work. The edges of repeating patterns sometimes align with a uniformity that resembles machine-cut surfaces, and certain decorative grooves maintain consistent depth across long stretches of stone that would normally be difficult to reproduce by hand without leaving visible variations. While this observation does not prove anything unusual by itself, it raises an interesting question about the methods that were used to shape these massive building elements during the early stages of the city's development. Another intriguing feature appears in the stone blocks themselves, because many structures incorporate enormous pieces of carved stone that would have required complex quarrying, transportation, and lifting techniques. Moving such blocks through a growing city filled with narrow streets and primitive equipment would have demanded impressive logistical coordination. Cranes powered by steam engines did exist during the later stages of the 19th century, yet some of the earliest buildings displaying these heavy decorative stones appear in records before such machinery became widespread in urban construction. Even more fascinating is the way these carved elements integrate seamlessly with the structural components of the buildings. Columns, arches, window frames, and cornices all align with precise mathematical relationships that reflect a deep understanding of geometry and weight distribution. These are not random decorations applied after construction, but rather carefully planned elements that appear to have been integrated into the architectural design from the very beginning. When all of these observations are considered together, the stone surfaces of New York's older architecture begin to feel less like simple decoration and more like messages preserved in mineral form. Every carved line represents a deliberate choice made by someone who understood exactly how the structure would appear when viewed from the street many decades later. The buildings seem to communicate a silent confidence in the durability of their design, as though their creators expected them to endure far beyond the lifetime of the society that first constructed them. If the official narrative is entirely accurate, then the early builders of New York possessed an extraordinary level of technical skill and artistic discipline that allowed them to shape stone with remarkable precision despite limited technology. Yet another interpretation quietly lingers in the background, suggesting that some of these stones may have been shaped long before the city officially began to grow, leaving behind fragments of craftsmanship that later generations simply incorporated into the expanding skyline of Manhattan. When the possibility of a forgotten civilization behind the earliest layers of New York's architecture begins to enter the conversation, many people instinctively reject the idea because it appears to challenge the familiar historical narrative taught in schools and repeated in countless books about the development of the city. However, Throughout human history, there have been many moments when widely accepted explanations were eventually reconsidered after new evidence encouraged researchers to look at the past from a different perspective. Archaeology itself is full of examples where ruins once believed to belong to one culture were later discovered to be far older than originally assumed, revealing stories of societies that had vanished long before written records began. If one briefly sets aside the official timeline and instead focuses purely on the physical characteristics of the city, an interesting thought experiment begins to unfold. Imagine that the island of Manhattan once hosted a settlement created by a civilization whose knowledge of engineering and stone construction had already reached an advanced level. Such a society would have been capable of designing monumental structures, organizing large-scale urban layouts, and shaping enormous blocks of stone with a precision that reflected generations of accumulated expertise. At some unknown point in the distant past that civilization may have disappeared due to war, environmental disaster, or gradual decline, leaving behind fragments of its architecture scattered across the island. Buildings might have collapsed, streets could have been buried by layers of soil and debris, and the remaining structures would slowly have been reclaimed by vegetation and time. Centuries might pass with little memory of the people who once inhabited those spaces, until explorers or settlers eventually arrived and encountered the remnants of something that appeared mysterious, but still usable. When early European colonists reached the shores of Manhattan in the 17th century, historical records describe them establishing small trading posts and gradually expanding their presence along the island. Yet written documents from this era focus primarily on commerce, political agreements, and the everyday struggles of frontier life, rather than detailed descriptions of the land itself. If unusual structures or stone ruins had existed at that time, it is possible that they might have been interpreted simply as strange natural formations or the remains of earlier settlements without much effort to understand their deeper origin. Over time, these newcomers would naturally adapt whatever resources they found in their environment. Stones from existing ruins could be reused for new buildings, foundations might be repaired and expanded, and partially standing walls could become the starting point for fresh construction projects. In this way, the physical traces of an earlier civilization could slowly become integrated into the growing colonial city, gradually losing their original identity as generations of residents modified them according to their own needs. This process of adaptation could also explain why certain architectural elements appear older or more sophisticated than the historical moment in which they supposedly appeared. If settlers were working with materials and structural frameworks that already existed, they would not necessarily need to possess the same level of knowledge as the original builders. Instead, they would simply reshape, reinforce, and extend what they had discovered, blending the inherited architecture with new additions that reflected the technologies of their own time. Seen from this perspective, the city of New York begins to resemble a layered structure in which multiple eras of construction overlap within the same skyline. Beneath the modern glass towers and renovated facades, there might still remain fragments of a far older design logic, quietly preserved inside foundations, stone blocks, and street patterns that continue to shape the movement of millions of people every day without revealing the full story of their origin. When historians describe the arrival of the first European settlers to the island of Manhattan, the narrative usually focuses on trade, survival, and the gradual establishment of a colonial outpost that would later expand into one of the most influential cities on the planet. Ships arrived carrying merchants, craftsmen, and families who hoped to build a new life in a distant land, and the early settlement slowly developed along the southern edge of the island, where access to the harbor made commerce possible. According to the traditional story, these settlers constructed their homes and public buildings from the ground up, using the materials and knowledge available to them at the time, while gradually improving their techniques as the colony grew stronger and more organized. However, if one revisits this early chapter of the city's history, with the possibility of forgotten structures already existing on the island, the events begin to appear slightly different, because the settlers may not have encountered a completely untouched landscape. Early explorers often arrived in unfamiliar territories, where traces of earlier cultures could still be found scattered across the environment in the form of ruins, unusual stone formations, or partially buried structures whose original purpose had long been forgotten. In many parts of the world, new civilizations have historically reused the remains of older ones, transforming abandoned walls into foundations for new houses, or dismantling ancient buildings to reuse their stone blocks in fresh construction. If remnants of an earlier urban structure had existed somewhere on Manhattan, the settlers would have faced a practical decision that people throughout history have made countless times. Rather than investing enormous effort in quarrying fresh stone and transporting it across difficult terrain, it would have been far easier to repair and modify whatever architectural remains were already present. Foundations could be reinforced, damaged sections might be replaced with new materials, and empty interiors could be adapted to suit the daily needs of the growing community. Such a process of reuse would leave subtle traces within the architecture itself, because buildings created in this way often contain layers that belong to different periods of construction. One part of a wall may consist of very old stone blocks, whose surfaces reveal centuries of weathering, while the upper portion of the same structure might show brickwork or decorative elements that clearly belong to a later historical period. Over time, these layers blend together so completely that the original boundaries between them become difficult to recognize without careful examination. The daily life of the early settlers would have revolved around survival, trade, and the establishment of social order, leaving little time to investigate the deeper origins of every stone wall or carved arch they encountered. If an unusual structure appeared useful, it would simply be incorporated into the growing settlement with minimal concern about who originally built it. Generations later, the descendants of those settlers might assume that their ancestors had constructed everything themselves, because the gradual process of modification would slowly erase the visible differences between inherited structures and newly built ones. Seen through this lens, the early development of New York begins to resemble a long process of adaptation rather than a single moment of creation. The settlers who arrived on Manhattan may have played the role of restorers and modifiers as much as builders, reshaping a landscape that already contained fragments of an older design whose true origin had faded from memory long before the first colonial maps were ever drawn. As researchers continue examining the deeper layers of the city, attention inevitably turns beneath the surface of the streets themselves, because Manhattan is not only a city that rises upward into the sky, but also a place that extends downward into a complex network of foundations, tunnels, basements, and forgotten spaces that most residents never see. Modern New York contains miles of underground infrastructure that support transportation, utilities, and storage. Yet within this subterranean world, there are occasional hints that the layers below the city may be older and more complicated than the official timeline of construction suggests. In many districts of Manhattan, older buildings contain basements that descend much deeper than would normally be required for simple storage or mechanical equipment. Some of these lower levels possess windows that appear strangely positioned beneath the modern street level, suggesting that at some earlier point in history, those openings may have once stood above ground rather than buried beneath layers of pavement and soil. Observers walking past these partially hidden windows often assume that the city simply raised the level of its streets during periods of renovation, Yet the scale and frequency of such buried architectural features raise interesting questions about how dramatically the ground level may have changed over time. There are also stories from construction workers who occasionally encounter unexpected stone walls or blocked corridors while excavating new foundations for modern buildings. These discoveries are rarely treated as mysteries because large cities often contain remnants of earlier infrastructure. But the presence of massive stone elements deep beneath the ground sometimes feels difficult to explain when the official history describes those areas as undeveloped land only a few centuries earlier. Each discovery adds another small fragment to the growing sense that the island may contain hidden layers of construction whose origins remain uncertain. If a much older settlement had once existed on Manhattan before the arrival of recorded history, a catastrophic event might have buried portions of that city beneath debris, sediment, or collapsed structures. Over long periods of time, natural processes such as erosion, storms, and flooding could gradually cover those remains with new layers of earth. When later settlers arrived, they would have built their own homes and streets on top of this altered landscape without necessarily realizing that older architecture lay hidden just beneath their feet. This possibility becomes especially intriguing when one considers how often large cities throughout the world contain multiple historical layers stacked one above another. Archaeologists in places such as Rome, Istanbul, and Athens have repeatedly discovered that modern streets sometimes rest upon several generations of earlier construction, each representing a different civilization that occupied the same ground at different moments in history. In those cities, entire neighborhoods have been uncovered beneath the modern surface, revealing forgotten roads, houses, and public buildings preserved beneath layers of soil and stone. If Manhattan followed a similar pattern, the modern city might represent only the most recent chapter in a much longer architectural story. Beneath the asphalt, concrete, and subway tunnels, there could still exist fragments of an earlier design waiting quietly in darkness, preserved by time and hidden from view by the relentless activity of the modern metropolis above. The millions of people who cross the island every day would then be moving across the roof of a forgotten world whose structures remain locked beneath the ground, silently holding memories of builders whose names have long since disappeared from human history. While walking through many older districts of Manhattan, attentive observers sometimes notice architectural details that seem oddly misplaced, as if parts of the buildings were altered or sealed long after their original construction. Windows appear halfway buried beneath the modern street level. Arches are filled with brick that does not perfectly match the surrounding stone, and doorways exist in locations that no longer connect to any visible entrance. These features are often dismissed as the result of renovations carried out over the long history of the city, yet their recurring presence across many different structures invites a closer look at what they might reveal about the past. One particularly curious example involves windows that seem to lead nowhere. In certain buildings, the lower rows of windows are partially hidden beneath sidewalks or street pavement, creating the strange impression that the structure once extended further downward than it does today. From the outside, these windows appear too carefully designed to have been purely decorative, yet their current position suggests that the interior spaces behind them are no longer used in the way the original architects intended. In some cases, renovations have sealed these openings completely, replacing glass with brick or stone that matches the surrounding wall closely enough to appear almost invisible, unless viewed with careful attention. Such modifications are usually explained as practical adjustments made when street levels were raised or when building layouts were modernized to accommodate new infrastructure. However, when the same pattern repeats across numerous buildings throughout the city, the phenomenon begins to resemble a widespread architectural transformation rather than isolated renovation decisions. Another unusual feature occasionally visible in older structures is the presence of blocked arches or doors that appear too large to have been designed only for storage spaces or narrow service corridors. These openings often possess decorative stone frames and curved arches that suggest they once held a more important role within the building's design. Yet today, they remain permanently sealed, leaving observers to wonder what sort of spaces might once have existed beyond them before later construction erased those passages from view. Architectural historians sometimes explain these anomalies by pointing out that cities constantly reshape themselves as generations rebuild and modify the environment according to changing needs. Streets are widened, floors are subdivided, and entrances are relocated to accommodate evolving patterns of commerce and transportation. Over time, these changes accumulate until the visible structure of a building becomes a layered record of different architectural decisions made across decades or even centuries. However, there remains another possibility that quietly lingers behind these explanations. If parts of Manhattan once contained older architectural layers that were gradually buried or modified, the sealed windows and blocked passages could represent fragments of a previous ground level that no longer exists in the modern landscape. What appears today as an inexplicable design choice might once have been a perfectly logical doorway or corridor before the surrounding terrain was raised or the structure itself was partially rebuilt. Seen from this perspective, the strange architectural anomalies scattered throughout New York begin to resemble clues hidden in plain sight. Each sealed arch or buried window may represent a small remnant of a forgotten stage in the city's development, quietly suggesting that the visible surface of Manhattan is only the latest version of a much deeper architectural story whose earlier chapters remain concealed behind layers of stone and time. When discussions about the possibility of a forgotten civilization beneath the modern city begin to unfold, one question naturally emerges above all others, because if an earlier society once constructed monumental architecture on Manhattan, something must have happened that caused its disappearance. Civilizations rarely vanish without leaving traces of upheaval, and throughout human history, entire cities have been abandoned or destroyed by events so powerful that later generations could only speculate about what truly occurred. Earthquakes have leveled thriving settlements in moments, massive floods have swallowed entire communities, and long periods of environmental change have slowly forced populations to migrate away from places that once supported life. If an advanced settlement once existed on the island long before recorded history, it is possible that a catastrophic event altered the landscape so dramatically that the original inhabitants were unable to remain. Storms powerful enough to reshape coastlines, floods capable of burying structures beneath layers of sediment, or even gradual geological shifts could have transformed the environment in ways that made the original city impossible to maintain. Over time, the ruins of that settlement might have collapsed or been covered by natural processes, leaving only fragments of stone architecture scattered across the terrain. Manhattan itself sits within a region where powerful natural forces have shaped the coastline for thousands of years. The Atlantic Ocean has repeatedly driven storms toward the eastern seaboard, and the complex system of rivers and tidal currents surrounding the island has constantly rearranged the shoreline through erosion and deposition. A single catastrophic flood or a sequence of violent storms could have deposited enormous quantities of mud, sand, and debris across the lower areas of the island, partially burying buildings that once stood fully above ground. If such an event occurred in the distant past, the visible results centuries later might resemble exactly what some observers notice today in older architecture. Windows positioned beneath the modern street level could mark the former ground floors of buildings that were gradually buried. Massive stone foundations might represent the surviving lower sections of structures whose upper levels collapsed or were dismantled long ago. Streets and plazas originally designed for a different landscape could have been abandoned and replaced by new pathways built on top of the altered terrain. When new settlers eventually arrived on the island, they would have encountered a landscape that already carried the scars of this forgotten catastrophe. Scattered ruins might have appeared as mysterious remnants of an unknown past, yet the practical needs of survival would likely have taken priority over attempts to understand their origins. Stones could be reused, foundations repaired, and surviving walls incorporated into new construction projects, without any detailed record of where those materials first came from. Over generations, the memory of the original disaster would fade completely, especially if the people who rebuilt the area believed they were simply constructing a new city rather than restoring the remains of an older one. Historical narratives would naturally focus on the achievements of the settlers who expanded the city, while the deeper story of whatever came before would remain hidden beneath layers of rebuilt architecture. Seen in this light, the mysterious architectural details scattered throughout New York might represent silent witnesses to an ancient event that reshaped the island long before modern history began. The buried windows, sealed arches, and unusually deep foundations could all be fragments of a landscape that once looked very different. Preserved within the modern city like fossils embedded in stone, quietly reminding anyone who notices them that the ground beneath Manhattan may hold memories of a catastrophe powerful enough to erase an entire civilization from human memory. Even when the physical structures of a civilization disappear, traces of its ideas often remain hidden within symbols, patterns, and artistic expressions that survive long after the people who created them have vanished. Throughout history, researchers have discovered that architecture frequently acts as a silent language through which ancient cultures express their understanding of the world, embedding meaning within geometric forms, repeated ornaments, and carefully arranged proportions that reflected deeper beliefs about nature, order, and the structure of reality itself. When such symbols appear repeatedly across different buildings or monuments, they sometimes reveal fragments of a worldview that no written document has preserved. In many older buildings scattered across New York, decorative elements include geometric patterns, sculpted figures, and ornamental motifs, whose original significance is rarely discussed in everyday descriptions of the city's architecture. Visitors typically admire these details for their beauty, without considering that the shapes themselves might once have carried symbolic meaning understood by the people who first designed them. Patterns repeated across facades, columns carved with intricate spirals, and symmetrical arrangements of figures could all represent fragments of a symbolic language whose interpretation has gradually been forgotten. Certain geometric forms appear particularly often in classical architectural design, including circles, triangles, and carefully proportioned rectangles that align with mathematical relationships known since ancient times. These shapes were not chosen randomly, because many early architectural traditions believed that geometry represented the hidden order of the universe, allowing builders to express cosmic harmony through the structures they created. Temples, civic buildings, and ceremonial halls in many civilizations were designed according to these principles, embedding philosophical ideas into the very dimensions of their walls and columns. If some of the architectural elements present in New York originated from a culture whose traditions predated the city's recorded history, the symbolic patterns carved into stone might represent the last surviving fragments of its intellectual legacy. Later generations who reused or renovated those structures would likely have preserved the decorative surfaces simply because they appeared aesthetically pleasing, without understanding the deeper concepts originally encoded within them. Over time, the meanings attached to those symbols could fade entirely from human memory, leaving behind only beautiful but mysterious ornaments scattered across the facades of buildings that people pass every day without recognizing their possible significance. What once served as a deliberate expression of cultural identity might now exist only as decoration, its original message silently waiting for someone curious enough to question why those patterns appear so consistently across structures built in different eras. If architecture truly preserves the hidden language of the past, then the streets of New York may contain more than monuments to modern ambition. Within the carved stone, repeated geometries, and carefully balanced proportions of its older buildings, there may still remain faint echoes of ideas that belong to a society whose name and history have disappeared, leaving behind only the quiet suggestion that the city may carry fragments of a forgotten intellectual tradition embedded in the very shapes of its architecture. Walking through New York today, it is easy to become overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the modern city because towering skyscrapers of steel and glass dominate the skyline, while endless streams of people move through avenues that never seem to rest. The city presents itself as a monument to modern ambition and technological progress, a place where human ingenuity transformed a narrow island into one of the most recognizable urban landscapes in the world. Every day, millions of residents and visitors move through this environment without questioning the deeper story hidden within the foundations of the streets beneath their feet. Yet when the many unusual details scattered throughout the architecture of the city are considered together, a quiet sense of mystery begins to emerge that is difficult to ignore. Monumental stone buildings whose scale appears unusually grand for their supposed time of construction, buried windows that suggest former ground levels now hidden beneath layers of pavement, sealed arches that hint at corridors long forgotten, and decorative symbols whose meanings have faded into obscurity, all combine to form a pattern that invites reflection about the true origins of the city's earliest structures. None of these details alone provides definitive proof of a forgotten civilization, yet together they create an atmosphere of unanswered questions that continues to fascinate observers who look closely at the urban landscape. Cities are often described as living organisms that constantly reshape themselves as generations build upon the work of those who came before. And New York represents one of the most powerful examples of this ongoing transformation. Beneath every new skyscraper lies a foundation that connects the present moment to layers of construction stretching back through centuries of human activity. If the conventional historical narrative is entirely correct, then the extraordinary architecture of early New York stands as a testament to the remarkable skill and determination of the people who built it during a period of rapid expansion. However, if even a small portion of the city's foundations originated from an earlier and largely forgotten phase of construction, then the skyline of Manhattan may represent not only the achievements of modern civilization, but also the quiet survival of ideas and structures inherited from a much older world. The truth may never be fully known, because cities have a way of rewriting their own history as they grow. Buildings are demolished, streets are widened, and entire neighborhoods are replaced with new forms of architecture that gradually erase the physical evidence of earlier eras. What remains visible today is only the latest version of a landscape that has been continuously reshaped by human hands and natural forces over long stretches of time. Yet the possibility that fragments of an older story still exist within the stone and geometry of New York adds an additional layer of wonder to the experience of walking through its streets. Every arch, every carved ornament, and every unusually deep foundation becomes a potential clue pointing toward a chapter of history that may have slipped beyond the boundaries of recorded memory. In that sense, the city itself becomes a kind of living archive, preserving silent traces of the past within structures that continue to serve the needs of the present. Whether New York was built entirely by the settlers, whose names fill the pages of history, or whether it grew from the remnants of something far older, remains an open question that invites curiosity rather than certainty. The skyline may represent the triumph of modern civilization, But beneath the lights and the movement of the present, there may still linger the quiet possibility that the city inherited part of its form from builders whose story has yet to be rediscovered.